Hey everyone, and welcome back to World History. Today we're going to talk about our first classical civilizations. This is really interesting. We're moving away from ancient civilization and moving into classical. It's going to be a big shift. So we're going to talk about two of the biggest ones that are out there, India and China. As we go through, think about our essential question: what factors led to the major shift in religion and thought that took place during the classical age? We're going to be learning about Buddhism, the golden ages of India, as well as Confucianism and Taoism and the dynasties of China. Okay, let's begin. Classical India. So as we talked in our last video, we talked about ancient India and the Aryan society that kind of started developing the 1500 BCE. Around 800 to 500 BCE, we have the development of new ideas, specifically one called the Yuma-Pasht, which questioned the Vedas and a shift in view. This concept shifting from many gods to this concept of Brahman god. The Brahman god was part of this like many god Hinduism, but specifically it talked about this idea of how Brahman was all powerful and all knowing, kind of similar to the Judaism monotheism. There's developed a new doctrine of reincarnation, which kind of started to shift away from that caste system. And we'll talk about some of this and kind of how it stuck and where it didn't. So we have a guy named Siddhartha. Siddhartha Gautama, who was an Indian prince, actually broke from Hinduism. There's a story about his life in which every day he would go out on a cart ride. On the first day, he saw an old man walking along, kind of creeping along with his cane. And his guide told him, one day you too will grow old. On the second day, he saw a sick man coughing and being ill. And his guide said, one day you too will grow sick. And on the third day, he saw a corpse dead in the street. And the guide said, one day you too will die. And so he asked himself, what is the meaning of life if you just grow old, get sick, and die? And so he decided to leave the kingdom and leave his princely duties and travel the world, trying to find meaning. And he spent 6 years traveling and learning about the world around him. He called this his spiritual quest. And during this time, he ate very little. He cut off all his hair and he traveled light, traveling almost like a poor man. And he saw humanity at its worst and its best. And from this experience, he gained enlightenment, spiritual fulfillment of oneself. Through this process, he became the founder of a religion called Buddhism. Siddhartha was also known as the Buddha, or the Enlightened One, and he taught 4 noble truths. Life equated to suffering not only because of sickness, death, but because of unfulfilled desires as well as hardship. Suffering equals desire. People wanted love and happiness and peace and tranquility because of the suffering, which this concept caused an endless cycle of rebirth due to this desire for new life and new growth and new desires. However, if a person strived in their life to relinquish their suffering and their desires, they could end it and actually complete a process called nirvana. There isn't a lot we know about the concept of nirvana. There's many speculations of what it actually means, but in Buddhism, it kind of is this concept of achieving enlightenment, whatever that might mean, and it's different from person to person. Everyone has a different idea. However, there are 8 paths that the Buddha taught about nirvana. If one had understanding of what is right, intention with what is right, speech in what is right, actions in what is right, livelihood in what is right, effort in what is right, mindfulness in what is right, and concentration in what is right. Basically, if one led a morally just life, then they could complete nirvana. This was a split from the Hinduism and caste system of India at the time. I especially didn't like the caste system. It pretty said to ignore the caste system. It didn't have any value or meaning in life. This spread throughout India for a while, but it actually would begin to fade later on. But it became a huge religion in China. It grew really strong, and we'll talk more about that when we get to more modern part of China. At this time, we also have the development of many Indian empires. So early Aryan India was kind of small states. They often fought with one another, and they were often under Persian and then Greek rule with Alexander the Great. However, when Alexander left India after a while, there was a need for a new ruler, a new kind of person to take over. And this rose a man named Standard Gupta. Standard Gupta conquered North India and became the first Indian empire of the time. He started out just conquering this top part, and then later in life, he would conquer the whole thing. His kingdom was called the Mauryan Empire, and his capital was considered the largest of its time. It was considered to be the most beautiful capital in the world. He developed a very organized government with separate branches for different parts, such as a branch for taxation, a branch for consensus, a branch for building and construction, a branch for the army, and he had a vast army with trained soldiers and even a spy network, which was one of the first concepts of his time. Spy network is a group of individuals who communicate secretly or cross distance through covert actions. So that it was really good for collecting information and really important to kind of how this empire kind of flourished at the time. After Chandragupta was his son Ashokar. Ashokar was his grandson, and he was considered to be a fierce warrior, just like his grandfather. However, he was a very gentle ruler. He ended up conquering all of what is modern-day India. However, during one fierce battle, he felt so overcome with guilt that he actually converted to Buddhism and preached nonviolence. He built most of the current Buddhist temples and monuments that you see today, especially the ones that are really gigantic and elaborate. He spent his whole life building. He saw his subjects or his people as his children, and he called them my children. And he wanted to do everything he could to give them beautiful and peaceful lives. So he built infrastructure and welfare, and he was considered to be the wisest and most beloved king of his time. He also developed. Upon his death, a lot of the kingdoms split. However, they did have still a very prosperous nation, especially when it came to foreign trade. And a lot of this had to do with the Silk Roads, and we'll talk when we get into classic China. They traded spices, peppers, ivory, and textiles for wine, oil, and especially gold. You can find hoards and hoards of Greek and Roman gold in India. And they didn't spend it. It wasn't coinage to them. It was decoration. They had these elaborate necklaces with gold, with Greek and Roman gold coins used as jewelry. Gold is considered to be one of the most valuable things in India, not as currency, but as like an item to have. It's very beloved, and even till today, it's still widely traded and used. So why was India so prosperous at this time? Well, it's the middle of trade. You have China on one side with silk, and you have Greek and Rome and Mesopotamia on the other side with spices and goods and olive oil, and it was right in the middle. So everyone had to pass through India to even get anything. And so it was very easy for it to become a very prosperous trade route, especially with all the spices it had. It was the only nation with the amount of spices it had at the time. Also, you have Buddhist merchants. Unlike Hindu merchants who believed in the caste system, so certain people couldn't talk to other people, Buddhists could trade with everyone, made it very easy to have a prosperous trade. However, there was still this huge struggle with the caste system that kind of dominated India and Hindu culture. And as Hinduism was the main religion at the time, Buddhism never was able to really kind of break that mold and keep and kind of bridge those gaps between peoples. After the first empire, there was kind of 500 years of nothingness, kind of the split empires. However, in 320 BCE, we have a new kingdom that rose, and the king at the time renamed himself Chandragupta after the first empire, and he told his son to rule the whole world. It never quite got as big as the first one, but it did have a lot of thriving, and especially with art, science, and culture. And it was actually dubbed the golden age of India. And we'll talk what it means to be in a golden age of something later on. So, but this golden age, we have our first ruler, Chandragupta, and then actually the next, the grandson of that ruler, Chandragupta II, became kind of this center ruler for this golden age. He was a Hindu monarch, different than the first time, which was a Buddhist monarch. And so he built a lot of temples and monuments to Hinduism. However, instead of building these out of wood, which was traditional at the time, he built them out of stone, making that not only did they last for a very long time, but he built these beautiful stone statues of gods and these beautiful realistic movement and kind of way about them, almost dancing in the sky. that is still considered to be one of the most beautiful artworks out there till this day, and it's considered to influence a lot of modern day architecture that would take place afterwards, especially in Greece. He was considered, Chandragupta II was considered to be a wise and tolerant ruler. And even though he was Hindu, he believed that everyone should be able to practice whatever religion they cared for. The empire declined after his death and eventually fell apart in 550 CE. So this is the first time we're talking about this concept of CE. CE stands for Common Era, and it's the term used to depict time after about 1 CE, or the shift in history and culture to what we consider to be modern times. So we'll talk more about CE as we get into that area, but I wanted to kind of reference in here and have y'all keep that in mind as we're going forward. The Gupta Empire developed a lot when it came to writing and science. So it developed Sanskrit poems, and actually had a woman named Kalasta, who was known as the Shakespeare of India, which developed these beautiful poems and literary devices in India. One of them being the Panachatra, which is a collection of animal fables that would influence and kind of shape the fables and myths that would develop in Europe and the Middle East later on. They also developed a lot of science. They refined how to make iron and actually began working on steel, which kind of shifted us into the modern age that we have. So we're actually going to start moving out of the Iron Age, but after the Iron Age, we see both bronze, iron, and steel tools. So we can't really call it the Steel Age. And so it's very interesting shaping of transition period that this Indian Empire kind of developed. We also have the development of astronomy, which was they were the first people to believe that the Earth was round and not flat, based on the kind of curvature of the Earth as well as the alignment of the stars. And then finally, they developed what would become Arabic numeral system, which we use today, and the development of concept of zero or nothingness. This is a very important concept that would be used to develop modern day calculus and science that would help shape our world that it is today. And it was developed here in the Gupta Empire. Okay, now we're going to switch into classic China. So if you remember classic China, we started in the first dynasty Shang, which are ancient China, which in ancient China developed writing. We had the oracle bones as well as bronze art. When we left off, the Emperor Wu had overthrown the first dynasty and established the Zhou dynasty. And so Emperor Wu of the Zhou dynasty believed this concept of mandate from heaven, or another concept of divine rule. They believed that the Shang had become cruel and tyrannical, and the god at the time had established Zhou as a just and virtuous holy ruler, mandated from heaven to take over and rule in the Shang's stead. They adopted a lot of the writing and government set up by the Shang because that wasn't actually their fortitude, and they had the longest running dynasty at the time, from 1050 to 250 BCE. However, they actually lost most of modern day China during their reign in 70-71 to nomadic people. But even though they had a smaller kingdom, they were one of the most lasting dynasties in China. So the Zhou dynasty, like I said, was really influential, especially when it came to economy and society. So they were the first people to really develop iron into what it would become, as well as, of course, you had the establishment of Silk Roads, which was talked about later on during the Han dynasty. And they had a huge population, over 20 million people, which was a gigantic population at this time, bigger than probably many of the other civilizations near it. They developed society, which had rich landowners and merchants, while very poor peasants with heavy tax and drafts. A draft is kind of a military enrollment that is in which men were forced to join the army as a form of a tax. So it's saying, like, you're going to live on my land. If I need you, you're going to join my army. And it was not the greatest at the time, but it did help them have a very vast and influential army at the time. Some of the biggest legacies is development of writing and literature, specifically a collection of poetry that would be used and kind of influence China from here on. At this time, you also have the development of philosophy. The Zhou rule was very tyrannical. They were very much suppressive and kind of kept the people down. And because of that, a lot of questions and philosophies kind of started popping up, specifically on what does it mean to live in society, life, have government, and value systems. 100 schools of thought developed during the Zhou dynasty, but 2 develop and thrive into what they are today, specifically Confucianism and Taoism, which we'll talk about in a minute. But a lot of this originated out of the Zhou rule. So Confucianism was developed by a guy named Kuyongfu Zhu, but modern Europeans call him Confucius. In 551 to 479 BCE, he lived as a philosopher and wise man, and he spent his life studying religion, rituals, history, and thought, and used that to kind of wander China and learn about people and values and ways of life. Through this, he developed a set of teaching that is still hugely influenced by the world today, not only in China, but around the world. It's not a religious concept. So we've talked about religions through Buddhism and Hinduism and Judaism, but Confucianism is not a religion, but a system of ethics. So somebody could be Buddhist and a Confucius. Somebody could be Christian and a Confucius. And so it has to do more with the system of ethics, how people live versus what they believe in. And so the teaching of Confucius was 2 main concepts. The first off were 5 relationships. So you have parents to child, siblings, so older siblings to younger siblings, husband to a wife, a ruler to his subjects, and then friendships. And so the idea is that you have one person who is above somebody else. And the most important of these relationships was a parent-to-child relationship. And this developed in what we call the feudal piety today, which we talked about in ancient China. And this idea that a parent rules over or has complete control of what the child does. But in the same sense, you also have mutual relationships like friendships where people are equal. And so the idea is that you have people who are above you that you kind of honor and show respect to, like your siblings or your husband or your ruler. But you also have people who are your equals. And knowing those different relationships helps you to figure out exactly who you are and how you're going to interact with the world. Another big part of this teaching was this concept of an ideal ruler. An ideal ruler maintained tradition, especially these 5 relationships with others. They know the literacy and the teachings and the poetry of the time, the laws and the rituals of the people, and they practiced it well. And they were a moral example, and by being a moral example, the people would do good. So this is concept that if they did good and they had good desires, and then the people would do good and have good desires. It also developed the concept of a gentleman, a man of mild and well-balanced behavior and action, which would be a huge influence in medieval and Renaissance Europe, which we'll talk about next semester. But a lot of that comes from this early teachings of the Confucius, as well as the development of the Golden Rule. Well, Confucius wasn't the first person to ever think about this concept of treat others the way you want to be treated. It was one of the earliest, and it helped spread throughout the world, especially in Europe, this idea of kind of just peaceful coexistence with others. On the other hand, you have the development of Taoism, which vastly contradicts what Confucianism is all about. So while Confucianism is all about society and tradition and kind of connection with others, Taoism is all about the individual. Nature over society, people over the collective, and living for today instead of living for tradition. The founder of this religion was a man they believed to be Laozi, though many don't even know if he existed, if he was just a legend. But there's this story that says that Laozi actually met with Confucius, and when Confucius was telling his teachings, he said, well, why should you live for the tradition of the past when you have today? They're all dead and gone. And so this meeting of the minds kind of developed into this concept of Taoism, where a person's place was to live in the universe, not to live in society or tradition. Dao Di Xing was the concept, and Dao just means the word way or to live. It was this mystery order of everything, and people strive to live in harmony with the world and the universe based on this concept of Dao Di Xing. It's kind of confusing, and many of its literary works are hard to understand, and not a lot of people actually know what it stood for and what it didn't. But one of the biggest concepts is yin and yang, which is this concept of balance or harmony, that everything has a good and a bad, a positive and a negative, a female form and a male form, a balance in the world that creates a harmony and kind of connection where there wasn't one before. So we're going to start getting into some of the different dynasties. After the Zhou dynasty, you have a man called Qin Shi Huangjing. I'm probably saying that wrong, but his nickname was Tiger of China, and he was the ruler of the Qin state, was the western part of China at the time, which, if you remember, was stolen from the Zhou earlier in history. They were a warlike group famed for horseback fighting or cavalry fighting, which was very different and new at this time. They would actually go and conquer the Zhou Empire and unite China all together. And after doing so, they would melt all weapons except for the ones that the Qin soldiers housed. And it was considered to be one of the harshest rule in China. They were not loved, especially Qin Shi, but they helped develop China in a lot of ways that would continue to today. So some of the things the Qin dynasty established was they developed what would become the early foundations of the Wall of China, though it was actually built up later on, as well as canals for trading. So they would carve out canals in the two great rivers in order to kind of allow for trade. They also stabilized the coinage, which means they made all coins to be exactly the same, which helped kind of give trade a fair chance, because instead of doing everything by weight, it was just you handed a coin and then you handed back, made everything equal. However, Qin was a harsh ruler. He had a group of advisors called legalists who believed in harsh and strict rule and punishment. They believed that a cruel man, a cruel ruler, would lead to a peaceful society because no one would oppose him. He opposed all ideas that were different than his own. And actually, in 213 BCE, he would be one of the first people to ever command all books to be burned. Would it be the last time this happened? But would be one of the first times, and it destroyed a lot of early Chinese history and culture. And it would be decades before before people began to really bounce back from this horrific action. Upon death, Qin's people rejoiced and rebelled, and there was years of rebellion. And he actually buried himself with a stone army, thousands upon thousands of terracotta warriors, which are these stone warriors that made out of a material called terracotta, in order to protect him in death. And it was very interesting, very almost pharaoh-like in building. After the Qin, you have the Han dynasty. There was a rebel general called Li Bang who overthrew the Qin dynasty, and he developed 400 years of glory, what would become the golden age of China, and we'll talk more about it in a moment. Li Bang, which would be the ruler of the Han dynasty, was the first commoner to rule, and he was beloved by his people. He abolished Qin law and believed wholeheartedly in the Confucius ideal ruler. He lived his life to be a gentleman, a wise and benevolent ruler, and to lead with grace. His great-grandson, Wu Di, would take over, and he would expand China, reconstruct the army, and invade Vietnam, kind of developing it into a modern-day imperialistic army, which we'll talk about a little bit later and kind of what that did. He appointed ministers and developed trade, and this would be the firm establishment, we've talked about it so much, of the Silk Road. It would finally become into its ideal form, in which people traded all over the ancient world. He was not a very nice ruler. He was pretty cruel and malicious, and he took over and destroyed people, but he was respected. He did things not because he wanted to be cruel, but because he knew sometimes cruel acts led to prosperous nations, and he wouldn't do things like burn books like the Qins. Through him, you have the golden age of China, where agriculture bloomed and blossomed to the development of technology such as horse reins and shoes, as well as early forms of gunpowder. You have a surplus and a huge population growth, even bigger than the Zhou. You have a growth and development of new cities, national trade with the export of wool and glass to Rome, that developed what would become the foundations of the Silk Roads. We talked about the Silk Roads quite a bit so far, and I've kind of brought it up, but we haven't gone to a place of its firm establishment until right now. The Han Dynasty is the establishment of the Silk Roads. Yay, we're finally here, basically connecting modern-day Turkey to China through this everlasting road that went through China and India and Mesopotamia and Egypt, all the way up to what is modern day Rome and what was Turkey. And so you have Rome, Greek, Persia, Egypt, China, and India, all trading across the world for different things like silk and iron and jewelry, and we've become the establishment of what we have, kind of what we have in trade today. It was this first concept of globalized trading that developed into kind of what we do today as a modern society. So the Han Dynasty had a lot of different things. One of the biggest things was their government. They were the first nation to develop this concept of taxation and using taxation to influence subjects, which is still prevalent in China today. For example, they heavily believed in the concept of marriage. So unmarried women would be heavily taxed, while they also believed farmers should be honored and respected. So farmers had a very light tax. They also developed this concept of a work tax. Instead of paying goods, 1 month out of a year, everybody had to do some kind of manual labor for the government, whether that's build roads or help in the community. They united, remember they conquered and united all of China. They standardized coin and law, quite like the Queen, as well as assimilated their conquered people, which means to integrate people groups into one another through cultures, values, and morals. They also developed this concept of education when it came to officials and officer positions. Instead of just an officer being appointed because they're family connections, they developed this concept of going to school specifically to study Confucianism. And they had to take a test before they could become the leader of their government, which is still used today in China as the basis for their officers. They have to take an exam. They also had a very rich society. Like I said, farmers were honored at this time, especially because of how rich agriculture meant to them. However, that didn't mean that it really changed much when it came to wealth. Farmers were still very poor, and the wealthy people were landowners, officials, and merchants. Women at this time had few power and roles, and they were considered to be very subservient to men. But they had one of the most important roles, which is the creation of silk, would be the foundation of their trade. So they created one of the main resources of the nation. You also had the development of one of the first female historians, Ban Zhou, who wrote on kind of women's life and the woman's role. And they had a humble and respectful quality about them and believed that women should always be humble and respectful and kind of down to earth, which would actually be a huge concept that developed in Greek and Rome at this time as well. You have culture and art that developed during this time, especially the writing and the invention of paper. Paper, very important. The development of paper during this time would be hugely influential and help kind of change writing, making it easier and more efficient. Development of books and literature, as well as rewrite some of the old works that the Quins destroyed, as well as an establishment of new works like the poetry records of historical records that had thousands of poetries that were collected at this time. You also development of art, tomb arts, very similar to Egyptian art that kind of depicted daily life and parties on these tombs using these beautiful jade artwork, as well as the creation of jade figures, elegant pottery that would be used for trade and kind of value as a system even till today. Early Chinese pottery is still considered to be one of the most beautiful things and highly valued and worth tons of money. However, just like any kingdom, it doesn't always last. And in about 100 BCE, there was a lot of warring that was going on that drained the treasury. And the rich at the time refused to pay taxes, which put a heavy burden on the peasant people. And the people, in anger, rebelled against the dynasty, and it was overthrown. However, that rebellion was then overthrown, and you have the second Han dynasty, also known as the Eastern Han dynasty. They didn't regain all of China, but they did regain most of the eastern part. Not as powerful, and their government was often corrupt and disconnected, but they tried their best to kind of bring it back to that original golden age, though it never quite got there. In 220 CE, that's Common Era, about 300 years after the original decline, the dynasty finally fell, and in its place rose three kingdoms, and China would be split for a while after this, and we'll go into kind of what happens when China reforms later on. But even though it fell, Han developed a huge legacy. This was the golden age of China. It united and expanded the country to, honestly, its modern day borders and beyond. It was the height of culture with writing and art, economy with the Silk Road, as well as government with the concept of united law and education for people. You have the modern Chinese people actually refer to themselves a lot of times as the people of Han, because it is the foundation of what they believe to be the core value of their system, with Confucianism, Taoism, and everything that it values. As we head out, think about our timeline and the different people and cultures we just learned about. We had India, we talked about the Maurya India, as well as the Gupta India, and the development of writing and numbers. We had the introduction of Buddhism, Confucianism, as well as Taoism. We have the Chinese Golden Age, as well as the Indian Golden Age, all of which would result in a lot of change in culture and values that these classic religions helped develop. We have the birth of Buddhism and this concept of rebirth, Indian conquerors and thriving, a Chinese new dynasties that kind of influenced by philosophy and this concept of harmony, as well as Han's golden age, the Silk Roads, and legacies that still live today. Before we leave, I want you to think of the concept of philosophy, which comes from the word philosophia, that is a Greek word for love of wisdom. As you leave, think about the concept. What factors led to the major shift in religion and thought at these times? And how did that help bridge and develop these countries into the golden ages that they were? Think about this question and complete your post-lecture assessment, as well as remember to email, call, or come to office hours if you need any help. I hope you have a good day, and I will see you in our next class. Bye for now.